Amy Stone from Ohio State University and Jody Ellis from Purdue University. I'd like to thank you for attending this webinar this morning. Today we're going to be talking with Kathy Smith from Ohio State University. She is going to be talking about woodland management in the world of EAB. I can just bring that, there we go. I'm going to bring her presentation up so that she can start speaking. Like I say, I'm hoping that you can hear me. If there are problems with the audio, please let us know in the chat feature, and we'll make sure to try to take care of that. Like I say, this meeting is being recorded, and it will be archived on the www.emerald-4.info website. Kathy, thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to let you take it away.
Well, good morning. We do have flurries in Columbus, not a lot of snow, but I live in northern Ohio, and there was snow on the ground when I left home this morning. So we are definitely still in winter, and I know Jody says she's tired of snow, but sorry to say, I think we're stuck with it up here for a while. It's on. You want to... Okay. Is the volume okay? Okay. All right, so this morning we're going to talk a little bit about woodland management with and its impact as you look at things through the eyes of emerald ash borer. And for some of us who are foresters and also woodland owners, it's not necessarily something that we want to think about, but I will kind of put the caveat up front that while I am a forester by training, I'm also a woodland owner who has a section of woods that is 60% ash. So this is something that not only have I had to help woodland owners with, but I'm also managing or trying to manage on our own farm. So it is definitely a change in a thought process as we start to see ash trees die. Whether it's in forests along streams, whether it's in some of our urban forests, like this one from the city of Toledo that go from all that canopy to very little canopy. It's a change, and it's something that we need to look at and try to deal with. For those of us here in Ohio, when we first started dealing with emerald ash borer, our woodland owners started hammering at us and, what do we need to do? What should we be looking at? And so we went and tried to create a fact sheet that could help these woodland owners through the process of dealing with this insect. And what you see on your screen is the current form of the fact sheet. It's been through, I think this is its third or fourth revision. It has changed drastically from that first one, but it still holds true for the most part as we walk through some of these scenarios. And so we will look at, typically what we did is we broke up into 4 different scenarios where we looked at tree planting, we looked at plantations, we looked at stands that were less than 12 inches in diameter and those that were greater than, the average diameter was greater than 12 inches, and tried to create some scenarios for woodland owners. And our goal was pretty simple. How can we get some management options out there, or at least a thought process for our woodland owners to work through as they started to deal with this bug? Some things that you probably need to know. We put some guiding tenets through this process. It really helps if you try to be proactive instead of waiting for the bug to show up in your woodland. The years prior are pretty critical if you've got the opportunity to make some changes. And you really need to be familiar with your woodland, and I can honestly say that as we went through the process of creating the fact sheet, I knew I had a lot of ash. I didn't know how much ash until I went and started doing some plots in order to work through the fact sheet. So definitely some eye-openers. And for woodland owners, there's some questions that they need to think about. For land managers, it's the same thing. You've got to be familiar and understand, what your risk is when you're looking at this. So just some things to think about. Are you dealing with maybe something that's been planted recently? And as I said, we kind of looked at the 2 different size classes on timber, or at least on the size of your trees, whether you're looking at it from a timber aspect or not. So define your risk. what percentage of the stand contains ash. As I said, when I looked at my own stand, I knew I had a lot, but I didn't know I had that much. And I had plots that were 100% ash, and I had plots that were 30 or 40% ash. So it definitely is an eye-opener when you start looking at that. How far are you from the nearest infestation? How soon do you need to get on the ball, so to speak, and start doing some management, or at least looking at what your options are? Proactive woodland owners, as always, are going to have a better control of that stand when the bug gets there. And as I said earlier, it really needs to happen sooner rather than later. The sooner you can get started and think down that process, I think the better off you're going to be in the long run. Hopefully some of you have seen this. Amy Stone just sent me this yesterday, actually, I think it was. And so this is as current as we probably get in some of these instances when some of us were doing presentations and trying to stay ahead of the infestation maps. So this one is dated January 3rd, and you can kind of see where we're looking at across the country and where we're seeing as it spreads throughout some of the states. So for the fact sheet and the process that we worked at for woodland owners, we kind of created this decision tree. And it was pretty basic. You had those 4 situations that I talked about earlier. What were those management options? And initially we looked at when EAB infests and when it doesn't, maybe wouldn't infest. If you made that option, what would happen? For the most part, as we've worked through our way in programs here in Ohio, we've kind of walked away from that what if it doesn't infest, and really tried to focus on when it gets to the woodland and what happens if you make that management option choice. For planting, it's kind of an interesting one. When we first started here in Ohio, we definitely had some areas that we were still talking about using ash seedlings and plantings. We've definitely moved away from that, but for some states that are farther away from infestations, you probably still can use ash. So in planting, depending on how close you are, that really becomes critical, and whether you can find seedlings or not also becomes an issue for some folks. But if you're going to use ash in a stand, a new planting, less than 20% of it should be ash, and if you think about it, if you work it all out well, when EAB comes in and infests that stand, it basically does a thinning for you down the road. You use ash kind of as that nurse crop or a trainer tree. There's other species that can be used, and we here in Ohio and those states that are heavily infested will have to look at that. But for those states that are a little farther away maybe and have maybe a little more of a window, you've got some options, I think, that you could still use, understanding don't go heavy on that ash component. For us, one of the questions as we started down the road of planting and, okay, well, I've always used ash, what are my options if I don't use ash? We created this bulletin 924, which was ash replacements for urban and woodland plantings, and tried to go through and pull out tree species that you could use in plantings that replace ash. And I'm not talking about, replacing an ash tree with something like a crabapple or a smaller tree. We really tried to place ash, replace it with something that was of similar size and function. And so we put this publication together. A lot of states have tried to address these same kind of questions. I just wanted to kind of give you a flavor for what's out there when you've got some options to hopefully help you through that process, because ash has been used a lot in planting. Some of us would have called it, especially green ash, that plastic tree that you could pretty much plant anywhere and it would grow well. From the emeraldashboard.info website, there's a listing of some replacement publications that are out there. Good resources to use when you're trying to think about, well, if I can't use ash, what's my alternative? So let's look at the next scenario. In an existing plantation. I was a field forester before I came to Extension, and I really hate to think about how many ash seedlings I put in some of my riparian buffer plantings. Those folks got heavily planted with green ash, and so we definitely have some plantations that we need to think about. And we looked in that inch to inch and a half diameter range, but for the most part, as long as ash was a reasonable component, number-wise, you probably don't have to do anything unless for some reason some agency or some regulatory arm is looking to push to do something different. For the most part, for our plantations, we should be in good shape. But think about if you're wanting to do something, you need to start thinking about this last aspect that I've added here. Is I've had landowners call, and I've got ash and I want to put other species in, I want to take those out and I want to plant something different. If you are part of some of the federal cost share programs, you probably need to ask that question whether that's applicable to the stand that you're looking at. For some folks that I've talked to, there's the consequences of going in and taking ash out and planting something different can actually violate your contract and end up costing you some dollars that you'll have to pay back. So it's a good thing to talk with the forester perhaps that helped do the plan, or if you're on that professional side and you're that forester, understand what those options are for those landowners that maybe want to make some substitutions and not let the ash continue to grow in those plantations and put something else in. It is one of those consequences we have to think about. For a woodland stand, where we're looking at the dominant tree size is greater than 12 inches in diameter, things get a little more complicated. We looked at 3 different management scenarios where we decided you're going to do nothing. You're going to have a commercial harvest where you're either going to harvest some or all of your ash, and hopefully perhaps some other species as appropriate. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And perhaps a commercial harvest isn't the option that you're looking for and you just want to remove or deaden ash. That goes back to those stand objectives, whether the landowner wants to do a harvest or whether they just want standing dead trees. When we first started this process, this gets a very complicated and wordy screen, but basically we're going to look at if the EAB infest side of things as we walk through these processes. If we do nothing, you are going to lose some of that monetary value if you're looking at a stand that has some dollar value to it. And ash is one of those species that starts to deteriorate fairly fast. We actually had a sale marked on our Lima campus that this past summer, with it being so hot, trees really started to decline quickly and had almost no value from some of the buyers that were looking at trees. So something to keep in mind is that ash is not one that will stand well. And if you're in a woodland area, a park, or some other area where you have folks that are recreating in the woods, it becomes a safety issue because ash does not come down in nice little pieces parts as some species do. It has a tendency to come down in large chunks, and so it's something to keep in mind. If you've decided to do nothing, your management options at that point, your flexibility has really been reduced because you're pretty much letting nature take its course. I'm a firm believer, though, as long as you've looked at all your pros and cons and that works well with your management objectives, then so be it. Folks just have to think about that, what they want long term, and does this work well for what they're looking at. One of the huge things I think we're all going to have to face is that as the canopies open, and especially in stands that are heavy with ash, the potential for increased invasive species is going to be huge. Our riparian corridors here in Ohio open up those stands, and the bush honeysuckle that's already there is going to become much more prevalent, and some of the other species that we're dealing with will definitely take advantage of that open canopy. So it's something to think about. If you decide to have a commercial harvest, there's some things that you have to think about. For those of us in the early stages of emerald ash borer, we couldn't make an ash-only sale go. We pretty much, if it was just ash species that were being offered for sale, timber sales weren't moving. They needed to have some other species in that sale in order to get the sale to move. If you're thinking, a commercial harvest, you're going to mitigate some of that impact of EAB. You're probably not going to take all of the ash out, so you're still going to lose some trees, but you've definitely reduced the impact that the bug will have on your woodland. But the big one is it really gives you the opportunity to shift the growth capacity of the site to those non-ash species. Hopefully you have some other species there that you can focus on and are not like my stand, the section of stand that is ash, 60% ash. My other species are elm, cottonwood, and some very cankered walnut with nectaria canker. So that was not one of my options when it came time for harvest. But something to think about. Every site has that potential, and gives you that opportunity to shift that growth onto some other species. Your woodlands are going to change. I don't think that we still have a good grasp of how the character of our woodlands are going to change. We know that they changed when we lost some of our other species out of the stands, things like chestnut and some of those other ones, but it's going to change again, and we'll have to kind of wait and see what adapts. You may still get some natural reproduction when you have the harvest. Stump sprouts, some of the ash seed that was in the soil that will sprout. Realizing though that once the stand is infested, that those are just as susceptible to infestation for EAB as the larger stems were. And at some point, any of that ash that you leave behind, you'll lose. Just to kind of give you a perspective, this is actually from my bottomland forest, and as you can see, the majority of those trees that you're looking at there are ash. Some of those are gone. We've already had one harvest, and we'll probably have another one here in the next couple of years. Get them up, get them down, and get them out is kind of what we're looking at when we're talking about the commercial harvest. For some landowners, or even some park entities, it's not talking about having a commercial harvest isn't an option. They either don't like the aftermath of the harvest, or it's just not what they want to do. And so you're either going to remove ash from the stand, and you're going to girdle them, leave them standing dead. You're still going to have an impact on the infestation of EAB because you've reduced that food source, but how you're impacting it is probably going to be a little bit different, because you are going to have more standing dead trees than you would if you were commercially harvesting them and getting them out of the stand. You are still shifting that growth to the non-ash species, and that's truly what we need to look at, is what's that next species in the stand. The ash aren't going to be there. What can we focus on no matter what your management objectives are? At this point, before you have an infestation of EAB, you're still going to get some natural reproduction of ash. We're seeing from some stands that were killed by EAB, we're not seeing reproduction, but for those of you that kind of work ahead of the infestation, you should still see some natural reproduction of ash. And you can still get some products out of the stand. Firewood definitely ash makes a wonderful firewood, and there is still some opportunity there for some products if a wholesale commercial harvest is not in the game plan. But I can't emphasize enough, even in this aspect, it's the invasive species side that I think we haven't really gotten a grasp on yet. That's that next phase that we're all going to start to see in some shape or form. And landowners, no matter who they are, need to think about that when the canopy opens. Those are opportunistic plants, and in they will come. So what if you have a woodland stand that is less than 12 inches average diameter? And this photo here that you can see is actually outside the back door of my house. Again, ash, elm, a little bit of red maple in here, a little bit of sugar maple on some edges, but for the most part it's ash and elm. I hate to say that. So when we looked at small species, we were looking at two scenarios. Does the stand contain an adequate number and distribution of desirable trees, so that when the ash is gone, what are you left with? What are you trying to accomplish, and what you're left with, is it going to help you accomplish those goals once the ash is gone from the stand? The flip side of that is basically what I've been dealing with, is the stand does not contain an adequate number and distribution of desirable trees. And I think for some landowners, I've heard the discussions of, maybe I need to shift what desirable tree is for me, and that goes back to those landowner goals and objectives. So you need to kind of look at that, take a good look at the stand and see what's there, and think about that long-term goal that you're trying to get to. So if we look at the side where we have something to work with, that's kind of the good side of this, is that you've got some options and there's some things you can do. We looked at two scenarios, take no action and some type of thinning or a crop tree release cut. And so if you decide to do nothing, just as we've talked about through a couple of the other ones, you know, there are some consequences. You've lost that opportunity to shift that growth potential to those non-ash species. You do have some other species. Take the opportunity, instead of letting all that growth potential work on the ash, you know, shift it, work towards something else, as long as you've got species that, you know, meet your goals. You're going to have standing dead trees. There's no way to avoid that, and as I said earlier, ash just does not stand well once it's dead, and so that whole recreation and user side takes some consideration as well. The woodpeckers have a wonderful time. If that's, you know, some of the habitat you're trying to create, you'll definitely have plenty of that kind of wildlife habitat for those folks that will make use of some of those standing dead trees. But for those that are allowing hunting, recreation, and those kind of things, you're going to have lots of standing dead that you need to think about. The invasives, again, are still there as part of that, depending on how thick the stand is and how much of the canopy will be opened by the loss of the ash. If you want to do something, we looked at thinnings or crop tree release. Basically, crop tree release, for those of you that haven't heard the term before, you're going in and you're choosing trees that help meet your goals and objectives. So you've got a list of goals or a list of objectives, and certain species will help you get to achieving those goals and objectives. So can you go in and identify those trees and thin out around them, take the ash out, and allow those other tree species, you know, to continue on and utilize the growth potential and move ahead and continue to meet your goals and objectives through this process. It really is about shifting that potential growth. Instead of allowing that growth to continue to accumulate on some of the ash trees, why not take that opportunity and shift it onto those species that will still help you kind of keep on track. You've still mitigated or minimized the impact of EAB on the woodlands because you've removed some of that food source and you've made those changes rather than just waiting for things to take place on their own. What if your stand doesn't have an adequate number and distribution of desirable trees? This one really is much more complicated probably than some landowners even want to think about. We looked at 3 scenarios, and you'll see a lot of the first 2 are the same as we talked about, adequate, but we will look at a couple of other options. If you do nothing, again, you're still left with, in this case, probably lots of standing dead ash. In my case, I'm left with standing dead ash when I get to that point, and my already standing dead elm. And so it's definitely something to think about. That just doesn't work for my goals and objectives for that stand, and I think that's something that it becomes very difficult, though, when that's what you're basically looking at and you don't know where to go. So you really do need to think about this. If you do nothing, are you going to be happy with that future stand? When you talk to landowners, a lot of times, you know, they bought it for the trees, they bought it for the aesthetics. Those aesthetics are going to change dramatically if there's not enough other species in there and it's dominated by ash. So at that point, you really feel like you need to do something. Most landowners seem to want to try to do something, but this becomes a much more difficult task on this side. You can still do a thinning. Where it becomes a little more challenging is, if you look at the picture there, those lovely little blue tubes are Blue X tree shelters, one brand of tree shelters that I've got several different kinds that are out in the woods, and planted seedlings and went in and tried to put seedlings in those gaps where I was going to have canopy gaps with enough sunlight to try to regenerate and put some different species in that stand. you have to think about a thinning on this side really is designed to open up the canopy. How can I get more sunlight to the forest floor in order to regenerate these species that I'm putting in? You have to think about the seedlings or whatever method you're going to do to plant in this scenario. Dibble bar planting with bare root seedlings is a little difficult when you think about all that root structure that's in that forest floor. Trying to go in and open up a slit that you put a seedling in and then close the slit behind and get a good solid closure probably proved much more difficult than I even gave it credit for when I first tried some seedlings. One of the things you have to think about is if you're going to use tree tubes, one of the reasons to use them is because you've got deer browse issues, other wildlife issues. In my scenario, my deer actually pulled the tubes out of the ground, and I could go down through the woods and see their bite marks on the stake and the tube, and they'd just be laying there next to what was left of the seedling. So there's definitely some issues that you have to think about. Planting and underplanting in an existing stand is not like planting out in an open field. One of the things you can look at is small container. You're going to spend more money. You're probably going to put less trees in, but you can have maybe some better success because you're digging a hole versus just trying to do the slit. Have a little more control, but you still have wildlife issues. I have raccoons that will dig up those nice little container trees, and it's kind of like, can I replant it often enough for the raccoon to continue to dig it up? The third option when it comes time for thinking about planting is seed. You can go in the fall and try to seed and get seed in the ground and see if that does a little better. I have not tried that. My goal was for this past fall to try that, but I haven't hit that point yet. I've got some garlic mustard I have to control first. So some things to think about. It's definitely an option to go in and underplant and try to put some different species into these stands that don't have a lot of species diversity, but it's not going to be easy. This is probably more intensive than a lot of landowners want to get to, but in my case, if I didn't do something, I wasn't going to be left with a stand that I was going to be happy with. Definitely was not going to work towards my goals and objectives. So something had to be done, and I'm trying things and learning as we go. You still can have firewood. I've got a lot of friends that are burning firewood out of my woods this year, and so definitely an opportunity to open up the stand and take some of the firewood out. And just kind of another image out of my own woods where I've gone through and planted. You can completely remove the current forest, and this is definitely probably the most drastic, and most scenarios isn't something that's going to end up out there for a lot of landowners, but for some that are dealing maybe with more larger lands, depending on the scenario and the environment that you're working in, you can just decide it's not going to work, there's nothing we can do, we're going to start over. So we're going to cut it all off and allow nature to take its course. And at that point, you're taking whatever species Mother Nature gives you, which means you really do need to look at what is around the stand that you're removing, because that's where the seed source is going to come from. Something to think about. You need to look at what that option is. If it's all ash that's surrounding you, removing the stand's probably not going to improve your species composition all that much. So you do need to think about that. You can still go in these areas where you've done kind of that whole clear cut or removal and plant, but this can be as challenging as underplanting sometimes in a smaller woodland scenario. So again, you still have to deal with wildlife issues and some of the other scenarios that I talked about before, but it is an option if the seed source that's surrounding you is not what you're seeing. This probably is the scenario that most folks aren't going to think about, but it's an option, and it's one of those options we laid out there to at least make folks look and think through the process. So as we kind of look at big picture, if you are dealing with this or going to be dealing with this, it's much better to be proactive rather than reactive. If you can work ahead of the infestations, I think you're going to be much happier farther down the road. It's crucial to be knowledgeable and stay current. I mean, you're on here today, and hopefully you will continue to stay up with things. We've definitely learned here in Ohio, as I said, this is the third or fourth reiteration of this fact sheet, and you have to stay with it. You have to stay with the research and understand what's changing, what's going on, because it's definitely in constant change. One of the key things, whether you're working with someone or whether you are that landowner that has property to work with, you need to know what those ownership or management goals and objectives are and evaluate how emerald ash borer is going to impact those. What does it change? What do you need to tweak maybe in those objectives in order to continue down the path that you want to go? I think one of the critical ones for us as we've worked through this process is how familiar are you really with your woodland? What do you know about your woods? What percentage of it is ash? What impact is EAB going to have once it gets there? A lot of folks, landowners who have said to me that they thought they knew what their woods was, but when they took a closer look, they were pretty amazed at what was there and what wasn't there that they thought they knew. As always, evaluate. I mean, we really did this fact sheet to try to create that thought process, the decision tree, to think through some things and make some well-informed decisions. That's what we're all about, is laying everything out on the table, what works best for you in your scenario. So evaluate and select what works best. If you're on the landowner side, working with a professional forester, whoever that may be, or somebody who has a better feel for maybe what you're looking at than you feel you have, however that may stand, try to get that help if it's out there. I'm going to give you just, oops, that didn't go, we'll go back. These are just some of our fact sheets. Most states have some form of kind of forest management backup, let's say, fact sheets that can be used. These are kind of the packet as we started doing our EAB and woodland management classes across the state. These were the fact sheets that we were putting in the packets for our landowners. So it kind of gives you a feel for what we were trying to give them as a packet of resource material. The woodlandstewards.osu.edu website at the bottom is our private woodland owner education program, and that's where all of these fact sheets are linked if you want to take a look at them. But I just wanted to give you kind of a flavor of what we put together as we were starting to reach out to our woodland owners here in Ohio for their use as they work through this process. There's definitely some good online resources. The last one that I added there was the eStore.osu website, which is where you can purchase our bulletins. I sometimes get the question on the ash replacements bulletin, where can I get that? If you're in Ohio, you can get it through the county offices, but if you're not, you can go online and order it through our eStore option. And there is I don't think that's a current one, sorry Amy, but our outreach Emerald Ash Borer website, and then there's the emeraldashborer.info website, both good sources of information for folks to use. And last but not least, some of these trees are no longer in my woodlands, and that's kind of that next process is we will have another harvest, and we will work towards trying to mitigate and reduce that impact that emerald ash borer will have on our woodland once it gets there, of which we have not found it at this point. So there is my contact information, and hopefully if you've got questions, feel free to either give me a call or email me. The fact sheet is available. We can easily email you the PDF, but you can get it on the Woodland Stewards website as well as our emerald ash borer website. And with that, I guess we'll deal with some questions if we have them. Okay, I see Right. Sure. Okay. On the firewood question, you're right. Different states are looking at some different things. We're talking about buying it, locally and burn it locally. For those of us, and we're looking here in Ohio, the whole state is quarantined, and so we're looking at maybe a little bit different scenario, but it still is very true that firewood shouldn't be moved, and you should use it as close to home as possible. It's kind of nice for those of us that are out maybe and looking at being able to have folks utilize the firewood locally. For me, it's 80 acres of woods produces a lot of firewood, and so it's kind of nice to be able to have folks, they're helping me do my management, and they are using it and not transporting it outside our quarantines and working within the bounds of what we're looking at for firewood. So that's definitely something to think about when we were looking at much different quarantine scenario, and I know every state's looking at a little bit different the way they're quarantining some things. It's definitely, understand where your firewood's coming from and where you're going to use it, and not transporting it long distances definitely makes sense, because there's a lot of other things that travel on firewood. A formula to use to arrive at a percentage of ash trees. I don't think that there's a formula as far as, what's a good percentage, but I would say that if you're looking at a stand that is 20% ash or less, that's a fairly small percentage. And if you think about losing 20% of the stand, and that's assuming that that 20% is scattered across the stand, that's probably not a bad percentage. There's a lot of things that roll into kind of saying that's quote-unquote not a bad percentage. You're looking at the size of trees, the density of the stand, what else you're working with. So it's not an easy, is there a magic number? But I would say that in general, a stand that is in that 20% and less, if you were going to take no action, you're not losing a huge percent of the stand. As I said, in my scenario, my 60%, that opens up the stand a lot, and that's a lot of open canopy once all those trees are gone. And so you kind of have to think about it in those terms, smaller trees versus larger trees, how much of that canopy opens. That's probably kind of a wishy-washy answer, but it puts it hopefully in perspective that it's got to play in with some other factors. But if you want to kind of go for a target number, that 20% is probably a good number. When you start moving up over that, you're really starting to emphasize ash as that component. When we were, the ash-only harvest, when we were really in the early stages of emerald ash borer, that's true. No stumpage sales were moving that were just ash. I had consulting foresters that had ash-only sales that were just staying, nobody was bidding on them, nobody wanted to touch them. I think it was a variety of reasons. I think some of it was the loggers and the movers of the material weren't necessarily thrilled with doing compliance agreements at first and having to go through some of those hoops to move some things. But the market also dropped here in Ohio. We went from an average board footage price before emerald ash borer for ash, probably somewhere in that 20 to 25 cents a board foot, to at some stages it was 6 and 7 cents a board foot. And so there was no monetary value looked at for those trees early on in Ohio. That's changed. Right now ash is actually bringing upwards of 30 cents a foot, and I passed on my way home last night 2 truckloads of ash logs being moved. So there's definitely some shifts in that. I think that still ash-only sales means you have to find the right outlet that need the ash material and can move it. I think that there are still some entities that aren't going to want to deal with it. All depends on your industry, your market in the state. But for us, yeah, it was in the early stages. I think everybody they didn't want to mess with it. And so if there was nothing else there of any value, they weren't going to touch it. The woodworker side, using ash in woodworking, I actually just did a talk in Kentucky talking about some utilization options. We're really trying to focus on some ash. I don't know about woodworker groups. It's been kind of hard to make connections with some of those folks and put them in touch with folks who have trees for sale. But we did recently kind of showcase, there's some things that the Cincinnati Public Schools are doing here in Ohio, trying to match up some utilization options. Ash is a beautiful wood, so if you've got the opportunity to make cabinets or flooring or whatever else out of it, it's gorgeous, and it's a very good wood to use. Very dense, makes nice material. So it's definitely something, the utilization side is something that we can all focus, I think, on a little bit more, whether it's for, small craft woodworkers or whether it's a little bit larger utilization. I think that ash sometimes gets overlooked and shouldn't be for the characteristics that it has. Okay. Okay.
Okay, Jen, I just wanted to comment on your question about the experimentation with the natural predators of EAB. Yes, there are some parasitic wasps that are being released, and they have been released in different areas in a couple of different states. It's going to take a while to see if they are actually populating the area and if they are having any impact. So that information will be forthcoming as the research for that is evaluated in the next few years. They did do some releases of some parasitoids in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan this year, and they did a little bit last year, and then they have to go back and, of course, try to find those and see if they're actually populating the area. And then the next step is to see if there's enough of them that are actually having some impact on emerald ash borer. So that information will be forthcoming. Thanks for the question.
And Robin, I did see a question on the anchor tree guards to protect against deer. I did. As I said, the blue ones at least. I will tell you that the other colored tree shelters I used in the woods, the deer did not seem to find as irritating. The blue ones, for whatever reason, they found very irritating and pulled them out of the ground, stake and all. Don't know what that's about. Don't know whether that was the color or there was just the location, but there was definitely different reaction to different tree shelters that were used in the woods. And I have some deer highways through my woods, so I definitely have a deer population to deal with.
All right, if there are no other questions, I hope this information was good and you learned a lot. I'm sure that most of you did, because I sure am very appreciative of Kathy's efforts. Again, if you could let us know a little bit about you, where you're from, your profession, could you please email us at the email address, my email address there in the notes section. And thank you very much, Kathy. Oh, can you bring up, I guess we can bring up the map of Ohio counties affected again, but that information is also on the Ohio Extension website and the emeraldashborer.info website as well. Mary, if you want to check that out, find those maps. If there's no other questions, you can also contact me. You can contact Kathy at her information she gave. And thank you very much. And we're going to be closing off the webinar now. Thank you, Kathy.
Mhm.